Rome did not fall in a single day. It was not only invasion, nor only betrayal, nor only moral decay. Before the walls collapsed, something invisible was already corroding the empire from within: the financial crisis. Currencies lost value. Taxes increased. Soldiers demanded payment. Trust vanished. The question is simple and disturbing: was it the debt that destroyed Rome? Today you will understand how seemingly technical economic decisions initiated a process that changed the course of history, and why it still matters. If you like story explained clearly, deeply, and without sensationalism, leave your like now and subscribe to the channel. This helps the video reach more people and strengthens serious content about economics and power. For centuries, Rome grew through military expansion. Each conquest brought gold, silver, slaves, and new taxes. This model worked as the empire advanced. But in the 2nd and 3rd century AD, expansion slowed. Borders became harder to defend, and military costs increased dramatically. The Roman army was not small. It needed constant wages, supplies, weapons, transport, and infrastructure. In addition, emperors depended on military support to remain in power. Disgruntled soldiers could proclaim a new emperor at any time. This meant one thing: the government had to pay, and pay well. At the same time, Rome faced pressure on its borders, especially against Germanic peoples and the Sassanid Empire in the east. Maintaining legions positioned in various regions required permanent resources. It was no longer a temporary war expense, but a continuous one. But there was a structural problem. Without new great achievements, the extraordinary flow of wealth has diminished. The Roman economy was heavily based on taxes and agricultural production. When wars no longer brought great plunder, the state became more dependent on domestic taxes. And then came another critical factor: political instability. Between 235 and 284 AD, a period known as the 3rd century crisis, Rome had dozens of emperors, many ruling for only a few months. Each new ruler had to ensure military loyalty, often offering bonuses and pay raises. The result was predictable: rising spending and limited revenue. Without a modern structured credit system as we know it today, Rome did not issue public bonds like modern states. But it accumulated financial obligations, mainly in the form of promises to pay the army and increasing administrative expenses. To balance the books, the government resorted to measures that seemed like quick fixes but had profound consequences. One of them was to mess with the coin. The denarius, the main silver currency of the empire, began to be produced with less pure silver. The state mixed less valuable metals to make more coins. In practice, it was an old way of expanding the money base. In the short run, this helped pay for soldiers and expenses. In the long run, it led to a loss of confidence and inflation. The crisis didn't start with invasions. It started with fiscal imbalance. This was the first silent step toward collapse. When the Roman government began to reduce the amount of silver in the denarius, the change was not immediately noticed by the entire population. The coins still looked official. They had the seal of the emperor. They had the same shape, but the real value behind them was decreasing. This process is now known as currency devaluation. It was not something entirely new in antiquity, but in the 3rd century it intensified dramatically. Over the decades, the silver content of the denarius has dropped dramatically. In some periods, the coin contained only a small fraction of the original precious metal. At first, this allowed the state to produce more coins with the same amount of silver. It was a practical solution for a government pressed by military expenditures and political instability. But there was an inevitable effect. When more coins circulate without real output increase, prices tend to rise. And that's exactly what happened. Traders began to realize that the new currencies had less intrinsic value. To compensate, they raised prices. Soldiers demanded higher wages to maintain the same purchasing power. The cycle repeated itself. More spending, more emission, more inflation. Trust is the foundation of any monetary system. When people no longer trust money, the economy begins to fragment. In several regions of the empire, exchanges began to occur based on direct goods: wheat, olive oil, cattle, especially in rural areas. Inflation also affected tax collection. If the value of currency changed rapidly, it became more difficult to maintain fiscal stability. The government tried to react. In the early 4th century, Emperor Diocletian implemented a series of administrative and monetary reforms. One of the best-known measures was the Edict on Maximum Prices, issued in 301 AD. It established price limits for hundreds of products and services. The intention was to contain inflation and protect consumers. But, in practice, controlling prices by decree proved difficult. In many regions, trade simply ignored boundaries or migrated to informal markets. The currency crisis did not destroy Rome alone, but it weakened the economic base that supported the army, administration, and cities. When currency loses value, the impact goes beyond numbers. It hits collective trust, and without trust, an empire begins to lose cohesion. The problem was no longer just military or political, it was structural. The Roman economy was entering a period of forced transformation, and not everyone was prepared for the consequences. With the currency unstable and military expenditures still high, the Roman government had to secure revenue in another way. The solution was to increase and reorganize tax collection. But this process had profound consequences for society. During the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, the state made the tax system more rigid and direct. Taxes were calculated based on land and productive capacity. Farmers were officially registered. Professions have become hereditary in many cases, especially in essential sectors such as food production and local administration. In practice, this meant less social mobility. If you were the son of a farmer, you were expected to remain a farmer. The state needed to ensure that production continued to support the army and cities. But fiscal pressure has begun to weigh down. Large landowners were better able to absorb taxes or negotiate obligations. Small producers, on the other hand, often could not keep up with demands. Some abandoned their land. Others sought protection under large landowners, handing over some autonomy in exchange for economic security. This movement contributed to the formation of structures that, centuries later, would approach the feudal model. It was not an immediate transition, but it was a clear sign of economic change. Cities also suffered. Maintaining urban infrastructure, public baths, roads, aqueducts, required resources. As fundraising became more difficult and inflation continued to affect trade, many urban centers lost dynamism. The government tried to stabilize the system by creating a more organized administration and dividing the empire into smaller units for easier control. These reforms helped temporarily but did not eliminate the central problem. The economic base was under strong strain. Another important factor was the reduction of slavery as the main economic engine. With fewer wars of conquest, the flow of enslaved decreased. This altered the productive dynamics, especially on large farms that relied heavily on such labor. Rome was undergoing a profound economic transformation. It was not just a momentary crisis, but a structural change. The tax increase was not the sole cause of the fall, but it reveals something fundamental. When a state needs to extract more and more resources from its own population to support itself, this is a sign of imbalance. Debt, military spending, and currency devaluation have created a cycle of domestic pressure, and prolonged cycles of pressure tend to weaken any political structure. The empire still existed. It still had powerful armies. It still had monumental cities. But inside, the economic basis was no longer the same. In the face of the prolonged crisis, some emperors realized that maintaining the old system was no longer possible. It needed to be reformed. At the end of the 3rd century, Emperor Diocletian implemented profound changes in the administration of the empire. He reorganized the provinces, increased the number of civil servants, and created a more rigid structure of fiscal control. He also established the so-called tetrarchy, a system in which 4 rulers divided power to better administer the vast Roman frontiers. From the administrative point of view, these measures brought some stability. The fragmentation of authority temporarily reduced internal disputes over the throne. The tax system was reorganized to be more predictable. The state tried to better plan the collection based on the productive capacity of each region. But every reform has a cost. To support this new administrative machine, it was necessary to maintain high collection. The state apparatus became heavier. More employees meant more permanent spending. The economy needed to support not only the army, but also a growing bureaucracy. A few decades later, Emperor Constantine I promoted new transformations. He introduced the solidus, a more stable gold coin, which helped restore some of the confidence in the monetary system. The solidus has become a solid reference for centuries. This step was important. It brought stability to high-value transactions and international trade. However, the economy of everyday life still faced challenges. Not everyone had access to gold coin. Many regions continued to operate with devalued currencies or direct exchanges. In addition, the administrative division eventually became permanent. The empire was governed in two major parts, East and West. The eastern side, with economically strong cities such as Constantinople, maintained greater financial stability. The West, on the other hand, faced more military pressure and fewer resources. This economic difference would be decisive in the following centuries. The reforms prevented an immediate collapse. They gave breath to the system, but they have not fully resolved the structural imbalance between constant military spending, fiscal pressure, and limited productivity. Rome was still powerful. It still had organization. It still had prestige. But the margin of error was shrinking. When an empire relies on constant reform to avoid collapse, it indicates that its base has already been deeply shaken. And as the system tried to reorganize from within, external threats continued to grow at borders. What can we learn from watching Rome? The collapse was not sudden, nor the result of a single mistake. It was the accumulation of economic decisions over decades, shaped by military, political, and social pressures. Debt, currency devaluation, and fiscal pressure created an invisible cycle, silent but relentless, eroding the base of the empire. When the government had to spend more and collect more and more to support armies and bureaucracy, the population began to lose confidence in the system. Traders increased prices, workers looked for alternatives, and production decreased. It is the same principle that we see in any economy. When trust fades, everything around begins to weaken. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine I were intelligent and avoided immediate collapse. The solidus brought monetary stability, administrative division helped organize provinces, and bureaucracy increased control over resources. But each measure also carried a hidden cost, greater dependence on taxes, more pressure on the population, and growing structural fragility. The Roman West began to suffer more than the East. While cities on the eastern side, such as Constantinople, thrived, the West faced invasions, difficulty in raising revenue, and a shrinking economy. The base of the empire was no longer under external and internal pressure at the same time. In the end, Rome was not only destroyed by barbarian armies, it was already weakened from within. Debt was not just a matter of numbers, it was a symptom of financial and social imbalance. When trust, currency, and production start to fail simultaneously, even the world's largest empire becomes vulnerable. Today, this story is more than an ancient account. It teaches us about fiscal responsibility, balance between spending and collection, and how seemingly technical economic decisions can shape a nation's fate. Rome fell because it no longer had economic stability, and this affected everything: politics, society, defense, and culture. The final lesson is clear: even powerful systems do not survive prolonged internal instability. Debt, mismanagement, and loss of trust eat away at invisible structures before any invader knocks on the door. If you have learned something new today and want to continue exploring stories that connect past and present, leave your like now, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. Which economic decision do you think has weakened Rome most? Your opinion can spark debate and help more people understand the secrets of history. Don't be left out, participate and strengthen our channel.